We need to get rid of things. Legislation.
Madam Chair, we are good to go. We are live streaming and we are recording.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Good evening. I call to order the PCAC meeting of September 22nd, 2021. And I will call roll. Councilmember Miles, I think he's going to be late. Told me. We have board member Libby Darby, Supervisor Alcorn, Supervisor Glass, I don't think. Sure. Supervisor Franklin was going to be remote, but I don't think she's joined us yet. And Vice Mayor Elizabeth Parker is not coming. Councilmember Duncan is not here. And Councilmember Steele is not coming. We have Vice Mayor Spesky is remote, and Vice Mayor Banks is here, and Councilmember Friedrichs is here. Vice Mayor Martinez is up, and he joined us remotely. Great. And we have Councilmember Milan is here, and that's it. So we may start. We have summary notes of July 28th. Are there any changes? Anybody have any changes to those? Okay, all in favor of passing those? Aye. Okay, great. All right. First thing on the agenda is an update on transaction public engagement events. Mr. Jasper.
Thank you, Chair Gobert, members of the committee. Welcome. And we have some new information for you this month, and we have some older information we'd like to revisit with you as we go. But we're going to move to presentation first, which is in the packet and just coming up on the screen. So I'm going to cover the public engagement update, or at least the first part of that, and then Ms. Levin here from the consultant team is going to cover the second part of that. And then when you're ready, we'll move into item 4, which is also on this presentation, but shown as item 2 on the agenda for the presentation to update you on goals, objectives, and performance measures. I just want to point out that the person wearing the shirt is not just somebody who was in the street and we like their shirt. This is our shirt, we equipped all our team members who've been involved in public engagement activities over the summer with the same shirt, so that the kind of like a group recognition, branding for NVTA, and as you can see from the question on their backs, even when they weren't looking or talking to you, you got a sense as to why we were there. And occasionally people kind of get a kick out of that statement or that question. Next slide, please, Irene. Go to the one after that. So we're in phase 1 of transaction. There are 3 phases. Phase 1 is really focusing on needs identification, and you may be able to make it out in a little graphic to the right. It's a new graphic that the consultants came up with to replace the rather complicated siloed thing with arrows pointing everywhere about how our process was, which I always used to introduce by saying this is really complex, and that was my excuse for it being a really kind of difficult graphic, but it is actually a complex process. But we think this wheel makes it a little bit clearer in terms of. Can you go back? So the 2 parts of planning and programming, we show how they're broken down in phases. And if you can read the part that's under planning, the first segment says identify current and future needs, and that essentially is phase 1. So that's where we are. Planning flows into programming, programming flows back into planning. So not only are these the 2 primary responsibilities of NVTA, they are linked. You know, it's not like 2 random things we do. You also will see in the bottom kind of left side of the graphic, the bar that says funding. You know, funding is always the thing which gets the most interest and attention. It comes in at the end of the programming phase, but obviously it's uppermost in everyone's mind as we go. Harun, can you go back to that graphic? So if you're following with the meeting packet, we want to talk about the phase 1 public engagement activities, and these break down into 5 different activities. The primary one being the online survey. And the survey was supported by pop-up events, which we did do in person. We thought long and hard about whether we should, and we took all the safeguards that we were advised to take as we did those. We did hold some virtual focus groups earlier in the summer, and while the survey was up and open, we conducted for the first time some live chat sessions, which was basically like texting to NVTA staff through our website in real time. That was an interesting experience. And then stakeholders. So I'm going to talk about each of these 5 things, and then Dalia's going to talk about some of the more interesting stuff from the focus group so far. We don't have any feedback to give you yet on the online survey, other than what's on the next slide, which is some basic numbers. And in fact, the numbers that are in your packet are now outdated. So the responses shown here, when we sent the packet out, were through September 14th. The survey actually closed on September 19th, which was last Sunday, and the final tally was 2,318 surveys completed, which we were pretty pleased with. It's a decent sized number. Obviously, what's important is the distribution of people who are within that 2,318 people. The breakout by language, because we offered the survey in 3 languages, is as shown here. But I would note that about 5% of the ones who are reported under English actually in the appropriate place in the survey indicated that they were Hispanic or Latinx. So the Spanish number is actually quite a bit higher. So the breakout by English, the final number was 2164. The Korean was 89, and Spanish it was 65. But as I say, 121 for the English indicated that they were Hispanic or Latinx. But the total was 2,318. And the map just shows you how those people were distributed throughout the region. And when I say region, I mean the larger DC region, because we were receiving surveys completed from folks in DC and in Virginia, but outside of Northern Virginia, and some in Maryland as well. But obviously, the deeper the blue on there, and these are zip codes, the deeper the blue, the more in absolute terms number of survey responses we've got from those locations. That doesn't take into account density, but perhaps it does reflect density, and that there are more people who probably live in those zip codes, so it's not a surprise we got more surveys from those. So that's the update on the online survey. And then next slide, please, Harun, just very quickly for the pop-up events. We always like the opportunity to talk with the public face to face, and they seem to like that too. So the purpose of the pop-up events was to raise awareness of what we were doing and to encourage survey participation. We did have a setup so that people could actually do the survey at the pop-up event. If they wanted to, there was a QR code which they could scan, and then they'd be taken to the website to do it online. And I actually got a QR code for each of the languages, so that was even easier. We did 12 of these events. They were spread across the region, but as say here, that the locations had a focus on the equity emphasis areas, the ones that COG has designated, because we really were mindful we wanted to reach those populations that traditionally do not seem to participate when we do it just the regular way. So that's, you recall we have 3 core values, one of which is equity, and that was a big thing for us in transaction and funding. It isn't just about a project that meets equity, it's the whole process that we follow to get there has to be equitable as well. So we were very conscious that we wanted to do as best we could. PopUp events have translators available, and in addition to Spanish and Korean, we have Amharic and Vietnamese, but it varied by location. Some locations we knew to expect certain languages and not others, and we resourced it in that way. So next slide was the live chats. Not a whole lot to say here. We did 4 of these sessions. It was very much an experimental experience for us, to give us an idea as to, if we were to take this on a more permanent basis, what it would actually mean for NVTA resources to do live chats. One of the obvious downsides is that we have some English speakers in the office, but we don't have any Korean or Spanish or Amharic or Vietnamese in the office. So one of the challenges for us is if we get someone come on who wants to talk in another language, type in another language, we're stuck where we are right now. So that didn't actually happen, but it was a concern if it did happen. So we had to kind of. Finally, well, not finally, the next slide is about Stakeholder Group. Before now, essentially, we've not had like an officially designated Stakeholder Group at NVTA. We obviously have lots of people who register, subscribe to our newsletters and so on, and communicate with us and talk to us, submit testimony and comments during public comment periods and public hearings and so on. But we've never kind of had a formally designated stakeholder group. So we felt it would be useful for a number of reasons to actually formalize a stakeholder group, which we've done, based upon people who have already registered an interest with us through our online subscriptions. So we started from there because we didn't want to start adding people to this list who didn't know us and no history with us. It's a fluid list, though. If people who qualify want to get on that list, then we'll add them without question. But as they stakeholders, we're referring to organizations that either represent citizens or organizations that represent businesses or something of that nature. So there's kind of a leveraging situation there. So the sorts of organizations that are in that stakeholder group, civic groups, advocacy groups, chambers of commerce, business associations, and so on. Individual members of the public are not in there, and this stakeholder group isn't meant to replace members of the public. It's complementary to all the channels of communication we have with citizens remain open as per normal. But with the stakeholder group, we kind of feel that we can do more to get our message out and have it subsequently amplified by the stakeholders, and in reverse, they can feed back information to us from a larger group than just the individual representatives of the stakeholder group. So we'll see how that goes. We haven't scheduled the first meeting. It will be in late October, however. I would expect to meet with that group as needed, but probably about 3 or 4 times a year.
Are you looking for more groups, or, I mean?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
If they kind of make that general definition.
Business association, I mean, what would be appropriate in Vienna? Would you say we have, because I see in here you say Chamber of Commerce, so we have our own Chamber of Commerce, so Vienna Business Association, or is that something you would be?
Absolutely, yeah.
If they had a representative,
yeah,
and just send them.
If you send the contact information to me,
yeah.
I mean, it'd be great if they have expressed an interest to you.
Yeah, no, I get it. Right.
And we've had names suggested.
They understand. Yeah, they should. I know. I might have to.
List, but we've had no response from them, so they're probably thinking.
No, I understand. Have you reached out? Right. No,
so
I just kind of wondered. Okay.
We don't mind, but it does help a little bit.
Sure.
If they expect it. So yeah, by all means, if anyone has any one they want to suggest, then please send that information to me, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, so is there a list already of the people who are already members of this group?
We have it for internal purposes. We haven't shared it. No one's asked for it as of now. So
I'd just like to know, just to see if I should push my area to join for it.
Of course, I mean, the first thing we'll do is to check to see whether they're already on the list. If they are, we'll let you know. But chances are they're not, because we have about 50 organisations, so that's a pretty small number. I imagine even Herndon maybe has more than that. Homeowners associations, maybe, I don't know, but there aren't many, I don't think there are any homeowners associations on there, for example. Because typically they don't engage with us unless there's a project that affects that homeowners association, and then they do engage with us at all levels. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean they subscribe to our database. So we still may not know.
So have you invited all of the major chambers like the Dall Street Chamber?
Yeah, we have, yes. If they were already in our database, and many of the larger chambers were, then yeah, they're automatically on, and many of them are already communicating with us in this new kind of role. Because we want to kind of limit the number of representatives to 1 or maximum 2. Otherwise, when we meet, there'll be so many people that there won't be an opportunity for everyone to speak who wants to. So we don't, just because your organisation represents 10,000 businesses or citizens, we don't want all 10,000 people to show up. We want 1 or 2 of them to show up who can speak on behalf of the others. That's the value of this. But yeah, very open to us. The meeting's likely to be the last week of October, so we'll be sending out the first notice of that to the people who are currently on the list later this week. There's no reason why we can't keep adding new people to that. Moving on to focus groups, just by way of introduction, the focus groups, we have these in late July. These are invite only, necessarily. Because we wanted to kind of segment the participants in a particular way. As shown in the 4 boxes here, we wanted to have people who were either transit focused or were not transit focused, and people who were in the federal Title 6 classification. We don't use the federal classifications per se because we don't receive any federal dollars. We're not federalized in any way, but we often do the things that way because it's maybe the right way to do it, and so we use that as kind of like a definition for how to segment the population. So whether or not people were considered to be part of the Title 6 population or part of the general population. So that was how we structured it. There were 8 focus groups in total, basically 4 pairs of focus groups, 95 participants. Focus groups are not statistically significant in the way that we like surveys to be. Right? So we're not going to share you information related to how people vote, because that's not a reliable measure with that smaller number of people. What is reliable is the conversation that goes with it. It's a useful tool to rank something and then ask people why they ranked it the way they ranked it, and then you tease out of them what they're thinking. And that's the real value of the focus group. So we can get down into much more detail in focus group than we can. I'm sure I'm telling you stuff. But the online survey is kind of, I think of it as being somewhat shallow and broad. Focus group is much more narrow and deep. So we talked about current travel choices, particularly with the pandemic in mind. Issues going around Northern Virginia, core values, NVTA core values, prioritization of objectives, which is very pertinent to this conversation we've been having over a number of months and will continue to have over another number of months. And the types of transportation improvements that people would like to see, and also we touched on the emerging travel options with regard to technology, to see how people are thinking about technology as well. So with that, I've done the easy part. I hand over to Dahlia to kind of walk you through what we learned at a fairly high level from the focus groups. But it's very interesting information. And after that, we'll move when everyone's already on to the discussion on goals, objectives, and measures.
Absolutely. So again, as Keith mentioned, these are sort of 2-hour conversations with 95 people. So take that what you will. They may very well be representative. Yeah, there's several more. But we, as Keith mentioned, we tried to get to a lot of the reasons that people make decisions and the reasons that people feel the way they do about transportation, which is something we don't often get a chance to do. And so one of the things we were really interested in talking with folks about were the travel choices that they're currently making, how they've been impacted by the pandemic, how they envision themselves changing travel choices as we come out of the pandemic, all of those things, which is something, you know, everybody's been asking about, nobody's sure of. And we heard a lot of uncertainty. Is not being sure when or if they were going back to work, when or if they were going back to their regular commute. But what we did hear is that a lot of people, even in neighborhoods in areas that we would think of as being heavily transit reliant or having a lot of other options, are generally selecting driving alone, so single occupancy vehicle, because of the reliability, because of the flexibility of being able to do that. And occasionally mentioned was chosen for its safety as well. When folks talked about using Metrorail, they talked about it pre-pandemic primarily, and they talked about it for getting to work. So we had some Metrorail commuters, or at least once upon a time, Metrorail commuters. And folks also talked about Metrorail's use for getting into DC, for a show, for a baseball game, things like that. But a lot of folks that we talk to in these groups have very limited knowledge or awareness of other transit options that weren't Metrorail. They didn't know about their local bus systems, and they were generally just unaware, interested in finding out more about them in a lot of cases. And the folks who lived in some of the, we'll call them less transit dependent areas, so some of the further out areas in the region, seem to indicate that they might be willing to use transit more if they knew more about it and if they felt like it would be straightforward and easy for them to use. But for a lot of folks, what we heard is housing prices make it difficult to live near Metro and to rely on Metro. So that's all a challenge related to COVID. I think like everybody else, a lot of the folks who are currently telecommuting are expecting to continue teleworking, at least sort of a minimum hybrid schedule. Now I'll point out that these were done in the end of July. And when I came to talk to you all in July, it was a very different type of world we were talking about. So all of these are uncertain. All of these could have changed dramatically. We also, on the next slide, we talked with the participants at the focus groups about NVTA's core values. And we had them do some exercises before they came to the focus groups about what they thought the core values meant. And then we discussed with them how they thought the region was doing on these core values, discussing different definitions of these core values with each other. And then, you know, in some instances, ways that NVTA can incorporate those core values into what they do every day. So we did not have them define a single definition of anything. So these are sort of some summary things that we heard. But overall, our participants identified equity as relating to fairness. So really a transportation system that's serving everyone fairly. We heard that from a geographic perspective, but also from an economic perspective. Generally speaking, the 95 folks that we talked to think that Northern Virginia has some work to do to address equity. They said that it felt like to some of them that decisions tend to be made to prioritize wealthier areas. So they thought that that was an area that Northern Virginia could improve on. And as far as NVT's role, it would be the ability to distribute projects and improvements geographically a little bit better to help those lower income residents. Our next core value that we talked about was sustainability. And so what we heard from the participants actually surprised us a little bit, in that most of the folks thought of sustainability not as environmentalism, which is what comes to mind for me. But it brought to mind issues of maintenance and building infrastructure that will last a long time, and that was able to be sustained, which I suppose makes sense, but it wasn't what we were expecting to hear from folks. Considerations about the environmental aspects of sustainability for most of the individuals were almost always trumped by it's easier or more convenient for me to drive, so I'm going. So while nobody said, I don't care about the environment of the 95 people, nobody was necessarily at this moment making a big change in how they live their lives in order to achieve that. And so to address that, they said there was a sort of message that if the non-driving choices were better, were easier, were more convenient, then it would be easier for people to make that environmental, that sustainable choice. That was, we thought, very interesting.
Very honest, I think.
2 hours in, people will say a lot of things. Our last core value that we talked about was safety. And much like the conversation I think we had with this committee last time we were here about safety, we heard two primary elements of that, right? So safety from crime and safety from accidents or safety from crashes. And while, as most folks know, the roads are dangerous places. Yeah, I saw 3 crashes on my way here tonight. The primary safety mention was related to metro. And as it turns out, people have a very long memory for any safety incident on metro, including those significant ones that we had in the region a few years ago. And there's also concerns about personal safety on transit as well. Again, nobody had a personal story of a time, say, they got robbed on metro or something along those lines, but they had heard stories of people who had. So a lot of those things seem to stick with people a really long time. And so safety was an interesting one about where NVTA could be involved, because everybody agrees that safety is good. And so NVTA should encourage safe driving practices from other people. Of course, they were all perfectly safe drivers. This is what we hear a lot. But provide things like safer bike lanes, maintenance of roads and bridges, crosswalks, sidewalks, promoting pedestrian safety, those sorts of things. But very little mention of sort of roadway safety improvements. So again, these are things we've heard in other instances. A lot of people feel like they're going to be safe while driving because they personally are great drivers. It's something people feel about themselves. It's other people who are not safe. And so we heard that echoed a lot in the focus group. On the next slide, we did talk with the focus group about some objectives, and we talked with them about draft objectives that were similar to what we discussed in July as well. And so while we did ask them to rank them, again, with 95 people, we wanted to get to the why. And so across the board, highest priorities seem to be reducing congestion and delay, which I don't think surprised any of us. But interestingly, the folks who lived away from transit were the ones who were the most interested in seeing improvements and expansion to the transit system. So they were the most interested in prioritizing that. And I think they view that as a geographic expansion. Say, oh, I want to live near a metro station, something along those lines. As far as types of improvements, the majority of our participants picked as a first priority type of improvement was build new roads or widen existing roads. That was our majority opinion, but we did have a vocal minority that pointed out that widening roads has not seemed to do anything to alleviate congestion in the past. And so maybe we need to think of different solutions.
Was this in the same group? Excuse me. So like it's a discussion, a focus group. So it's like they both sides heard each other.
Yes, yes.
And then it's great.
They were not trying to come to consensus, so they did not have to necessarily argue with each other to convince each other. They in this instance, and that's vocal minority, I think they just wanted to make sure that people heard that there is a different perspective than that. And we may or may not have had one or two amateur transportation planners who said this. Not gonna. Oh, we're going backwards. The other piece that we talked to folks a little bit about was some of the emerging technology things. So electrification, automated vehicles. Automated vehicles in particular, I think, seemed a little bit abstract to folks. And so while they viewed that as maybe a long-term priority, they definitely saw other things as more important in the shorter to medium term. And while coming back to some of the environmental choices, folks seemed willing or open to owning an electric vehicles, but identified a lot of reasons why they're not doing it. Charging infrastructure, range of batteries, being able to charge it at home. I know that would be an issue for me. And so that, still has a lot of work to do, but folks seem to be open to it if those challenges can be met. So I think those were some of the big high level findings that we got from this focus group. Again, 95 very passionate, interesting people who gave up 3 hours of their week to us. So questions, thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm allowed to call. I'm waiting for your. Yeah, go ahead.
So back on the equity slide and the responses. So was there any differentiation between the type of facilities that were located in wealthier areas, the perception of that versus not? That I'm specifically wondering if if folks mentioned transit infrastructure, or did they say think about buses or is it rail?
For the most part, when transit was mentioned, it was primarily rail that was mentioned. There was a very little mention of bus in any of the focus groups, except when our moderators tried to bring it up. So I can say that for certain. I would have to go back and double check if there was a difference between were they mentioning transit roads. That one I'd have to go back and double check the report for.
But rail definitely.
Rail is what people think of when they think of transit in this region. That is what we heard for sure.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, I thought, I think a lot that the slide number 10. I mean, that's just part of the reason people think of rail. There's such a chicken and egg that people don't understand buses. It's confusing. It's hard to do, so they don't take them. And this group I haven't been with a whole lot, so you probably haven't heard the same stories. But I have a daughter who's lived abroad. And they were actually in Vienna, Austria at one point. She had 2 little ones, a baby and a toddler. A family pass that they just, a year pass that you just flashed and you used it. So the more you used it, the less it cost per trip, right? There was a real incentive to use it. The bus stop was not too far away, near a really good bakery. And the buses came every like 10 minutes. There was no problem driving the stroller on and off. So if somebody needs a diaper change or falls down or whatever happens in life, you get there. Anyway, so it was a piece of cake to take it, and it was real clear where it went. So she super comfortable. She took it all the time. Came back to the States. They were living in Seattle for a while, and she started out trying to take the bus. And the first one, the younger one fell, and they missed the bus by a couple of minutes. The next one didn't come for 20 minutes, and it was 5 minutes late. By the time it came, both kids were howling. And it wasn't easy to get on and off. And, so that was, she tried a couple times, and that was it. She took the car. And then people don't ever understand transit. They don't. So as you see, there's sort of this chicken egg. So I don't have a solution, but I think that's what this is pointing out. And we really, which I know we are. I mean, just pay attention to this. This is why people aren't. It's why I don't take a bus. Me all the time. Working on that.
Yep.
Working on that. And the more you get kids to do it, because the younger ones, my grandson actually in Arlington at one point had a friend and they knew how to discover it. oh, you got on that bus, and then they could get the metro, and then they could get downtown, a little scary at times. But that was freedom for them, you know, and that can really work. So yes, I think that's a key is the young people. All right, sorry, I think I've been on a soapbox.
Yeah.
So, New York City has a culture of public transit.
Yes.
People do have
Oh,
cars,
sure.
but most people take buses or walk or take the underground. Subway.
And I will say out in the suburbs, I think that's a lot of the problem that, you know, our local buses don't run, but, you know, once an hour or, you know, it doesn't make it very convenient. And if it's not convenient, as you all heard, people aren't going to do it. And I do think that this is interesting. And I do agree with Libby Garvey that, you know, until we can find ways to make the mass transit a little bit more convenient, a little more user friendly, I think people do have those hesitancies, even in environments when we have so many kids that are at colleges, they get used to using buses and then they come back to, you know, areas and they find it too difficult. So they go back to using single occupancy vehicles.
Did you want to continue?
Yeah, I did. So my comment was just, I think that there's a culture that we need to develop. And as you pointed out, you know, getting children to use metro. When I was a teenager, I lived in Osnabrück, Germany for a semester, and everybody, all the school children took a bus. And that increased the safety. But what I wanted to say about New York City is people still take all of the metro and the subway, and they still take the buses, even though they are famous for being full of, you know, crackheads and people who behave in really outrageous ways, because that's the culture, and they don't feel I mean, I'm sure some of them do feel unsafe, but that is the feeling. What I really wanted to bring up was a question of long-term versus short-term thinking in your study. When I'm really focused on environmentalism right now, because I think we've ignored it so long that it's gotten to be almost intractable, and we're afraid to make any changes. And one of the women I was discussing this with said to me, I don't want to have a choice that's not environmentally sound. In other words, when I go to the grocery store, I don't want to see a whole bunch of plastic. I want to be choosing between products that are in sustainable packaging. And that's a long-term goal. And I think when we're talking about transport, we're talking about how do I get to work in the most convenient amount of time, or take my children wherever they need to go, or go grocery shopping. And I don't have time to be sitting here and waiting for something to change. But if we think long-term and we get used to doing things that way, I think we can be sustainable. And if you've ever lived in Germany or France or any place like that, you know that nobody even really thinks about it unless they have to carry something enormous. So anyway, my soapbox.
No, I mean, Vienna used to have more buses, you know, more routes, but nobody was driving them. I mean, so they canceled them. So I mean, a lot of it is money. So are we going to fund something that people are on? And you know, New York City, because of the population there.
But if nobody took them.
No, I'm just saying, you know, I think some of it is population. I think some of it is, you know, I mean, you have to do some of these things in a city. You know, we do have one bus that we do have a population of Vienna that really does use it a lot. And we worked with a school. A lot of the families were using that bus, and the times weren't right for them. And so we really made it more convenient for them. So kind of, guess I'm saying two things. I mean, it can work for certain people who do want to use it. But you know, a lot of us need to like be there in 10 minutes. And so I'm going to jump in my car. I'm not going to wait. I mean, it's just convenient. You know, so that's
Well,
part
and the
of
other
it too.
thing is that we're out of the habit of planning. My grandmother didn't like to waste gas, so she would wait until she had a number of tasks to do, and then she'd take the car.
Mhm.
We don't do that anymore. We're just, oh, you know, I like an ice cream.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what? I'm gonna go to the store. I mean, we don't really consider it. And the other thing is those buses that we're talking about that are really popular, they're very simple. You know, you want to go to the Pentagon, you live in Reston, you get on the Pentagon bus, it costs the same amount every day, it goes to the same place. It's much more convenient than Metro, and takes much less time. So I think the simplicity in New York, the buses just go down a street, you know, Fifth Avenue, all the way. So I think simplicity is another key.
Well, New York does have the built-in advantage of having a simple, straight grid street. And unless we're gonna build one of those here in Northern Virginia, we're gonna have to figure out some different ways to make that happen. So that is a bit more of a challenge. Chicago does a really good job of that too, but again, natural advantage. But they circulate.
Yeah, circulator buses.
Well, does rail exclusively mean Metro for the respondent?
It was the thing that they brought up the most. I think we heard maybe mention VRE once or twice, but primarily, and it's not just when we say rail, it's when we say transit, Metro Rail is what comes.
And probably these questions get the issue that I think we're finding, which is it's looking like at post-pandemic, one of the big changes is there's not so much the rush hour. It's much more people that they're going to be using. They need to be using it like throughout the day, that we can't count on everybody like going in all at once, going out all at once. And if we design our transportation system for that, which we have, it's not fitting the needs that we have.
I have lots of things to say as a professional transportation planner.
Good.
But it's not what came out of our focus
Yeah.
groups, but yes.
Okay, yeah.
So the focus groups, do you think, I mean, it sounded like they were really engaged and really concerned, but do you think that if they had more time to think about the questions you'd ask, if you define sustainability for them, do you think you would have gotten a more information that was going in the direction you wanted them to, or do you think this is better?
So according to, the professionals who do focus groups a lot, you can in fact guide your conversation in any way that you want. But then you have to trust those, it's leading the witnesses, as it were. And so they were very careful to try and keep our questioning and our process as open as possible for as long as possible. So eventually we did say, this is NVTA's definition of sustainability. What do you think about that one? So we do eventually narrow those conversations. But initially we try to keep it open to see what the people will come up with on their own if we're not sort of leading them towards that. And I will say one other thing based on what you, the long-term versus short-term, we have found it's just difficult to get people to think in that really long-term way. And that's something we've known for a long time about, asking people about choices and preferences and things. It's very hard to get people to think in a really long-term way. And especially right now, considering the uncertainty about what's going on and what's going to be happening next, it's even harder for people to understand and think through what they really want 6 months from now, let alone 5 years from now.
Part of it is that's why we can't get climate change fixed, because as a species, we don't.
Well, but you mentioned honesty, and I think when you do ask the questions like that, people are going to be honest. I mean, I think if we ask each other how we got along around, so that's all. Mr. Jeff,
I think just to wrap this up, the moderator is the same moderator for all 8 sessions. I sat in on 6 of them, and in her introduction, she made it clear that she was not representing NVTA, and she had, she would, not be offended if any of the participants wanted to be rude about NVTA. I was going to go back to hear that stuff, and I was kind of cringing at this point. What am I going to hear now? But I guess the point being that the environment that was created for them was just to be open. There were no right or wrong answers. They were just their answers.
Right.
And I just kind of took in that the person from the market research firm who was leading the focus groups, said towards the end in one of our kind of internal discussions, not involving the participants, it just made very clear, transportation is something that is very personal. Transportation to everyone is individualized. They act in the way that works best for them. Okay, and even when, in most cases, there's a greater good that would suggest they do something other than what they do, they will always default to what's best for them. So when it comes to long-range planning, that's the challenge, is whatever we think the greater good is, people are going to do what they're going to do. All right, so the only way NVTA can kind of change the status quo with is, based on what we heard from focus groups, is probably to put a whole bunch of new options out there that would persuade people to change the way they behave. But it's not sufficient to just put out more options. They have to be meaningful options that actually will work. Okay, so because transportation is so personal, put out options per se may or may not cut it. Chances are it won't cut it unless you really do go down almost to the personal level to understand. At least not for individuals, but for, wherever you can, particularly with mass transit, you try and get some common theme that will work for as many people as possible. It won't work for everyone in exactly the same way, but that's what they really mean by something that's a meaningful choice, not just a choice.
A lot of it comes down to time and ease. I mean, in people's time, it's valuable. I mean, it's easier to use a reusable, I don't mean to simplify climate change and what we're doing, but I mean, it is easier to use, say, a reusable cup than, by plastic. I mean, that's an easy choice. That's not really taking that much of your time, but to go get on the metro and just real. I think it's just real life. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
One last question on the focus groups. Was there any participant bias given the pandemic in terms of, did we miss out on people that might be working remotely for some reason? I guess how were panelists or focus group participants selected?
So we had a fairly extensive questionnaire that folks had to fill out in order to see if they qualified to be in a group, and if so, which one of our 4 groups they
And
qualified.
where did they get the questionnaire?
Oh, we developed it, and the market research firm, as you mentioned.
They reached out to,
Correct.
okay.
Correct. I believe they have one of these random phone number dialers.
So there shouldn't have been any selection bias.
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
all right, great, thank you.
Except for potentially a self-selection.
Oh, sure,
But no,
that's what everything.
no, otherwise completely.
Okay, thank you.
No, good question. Good discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's all about the culture. So we just need to pick up everybody and move to New York for a while or Germany and we're good.
Culture in the street, great, no problem.
Yeah.
But there's other ways of doing it that are equally simple. I think the simplicity is the key, and buses are so much more efficient in a lot of ways. And as you say, because we have Fairfax Connector come and present in Herndon, because we have Metro coming, we have a ring road, sort of the Herndon Parkway, and we want to have a bus that just goes around all day, all around, because every place in Herndon is within about a quarter of a mile of the parkway. So in theory, anybody who's planned on it can easily get on a circulator bus and get onto the metro. And that will reduce need for parking. It will really reduce all kinds of congestion, because we're about to become extremely congested. But Metro keeps telling us that it's not efficient, it will cost more money. If they give us that, then they'll take away something else that's already working. So it's, our staff is doing a great job of working with them, and I hope we'll be able to come to a reasonable final situation. But I do believe, especially because Herndon is incredibly walkable, like Vienna, you have the subway there, we're about to have the subway, not contrary. So, we should be able to do these things. It's just, we lost that momentum that we had with Greta Thunberg, I guess, because of the pandemic. Maybe we can get
Do you have anything you want to say?
No, I can keep going.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay, Mr. Jasper, are we ready to?
Yes,
To move on.
thank you. So Adela's going to continue on this insight and call on the agenda, the goals, objectives and measures. I just want to say at the front, we're not looking for any action tonight. We will be looking for action in the form of recommendations from the committee next month on goals, objectives and measures as a block to take to the authority at the November meeting for approval. So we're getting to that sharp end now. But what we wanted to do tonight was, first of all, in a moment of deja vu, tell you what we thought we heard from you last month, but also to tell you what we heard from the Technical Advisory Committee and the Planning and Programming Committee. So you can see where everyone else is on this topic. Some of the things that you and others have suggested to us, and we've also met with the staff group as well. Some of the things that have been suggested we've embraced. Some of the things we have not, and Dahlia will tell you why. Obviously, understand here we've got 3 different committees as well as the staff committee, our consultants, and ourselves. You know, we've got to piece together something that works well for everybody, but won't be perfect for anybody. But hopefully, it won't be ugly for anyone either. But it's very important that we get through this process because time is marching on, and we need to look to adopt transaction by the end or November of next year. And the way this will work in the analysis is that the measures and the weights that are subsequently attached to the measures, and that'll be following on this process later this year, but the measures and the weights to the measures will really drive the analysis of the projects that are being tested in transaction. So, for example, if this committee felt that 100% of the weights should go to a measure that's related to walkability and bikeability, then that would mean when we do the analysis that any such project which is comprised of that component will do really well and everything else will do really badly. Any other combination of whatever number of measures we end up. The more measures we have, the lower the average weighting will be per measure, which will mean that we'll have lots of measures, which means we've got lots of priorities, but they'll all be a wash and none of them will be a priority because they're all kind of look the same. So I kind of put that caution out there that there's a balance between having all the measures you'd like to see versus being able to use the point system to prioritize the things that are most important to you. So with that, I'll hand over to Dahlia to kind of talk through the update from last time.
Sure. 2 more slides, I think. So this is a slide you've seen before, and that Keith sort of talked through a little bit. We have already been through some in the public engagement, which we just talked about. We are here squarely in September. As Keith mentioned, we want to talk about these so that next month, this committee and the others will feel comfortable making recommendations about the goals, objectives, and measures to the authority, so that ultimately the following month we can deal with the weights and have these approved before the end of the year. And we'll come back and talk through some of those next steps specifically. On that next slide, you will see our NVTA's new vision statement that I believe the committee had at hand in writing, and we've already talked at great length about those core values and how we want to make sure that they're represented in the measures that we talk about, in the projects that ultimately get funded, and as Keith mentioned, in the entire process as well. On the next slide, we've got for reference again, these 3 core values: equity, sustainability, and safety. You guys have seen these definitions before, and they are really representative of what we're trying to incorporate in sort of an initial thought of these definitions. And again, these are what was shared with ultimately with those focus groups. So time for deja vu. The key things that this committee had to tell us last time was that the resiliency goal that we had seemed a little too undefined, specifically the phrasing of unusual conditions. So we've revised that goal, and we'll get to it in a second, to better reflect FHWA's definition of resiliency, which is a little more clearly defined and also a little wordy, if I do say so myself. There was a request that the definition of safety needed to be expanded to include personal safety, particularly related to public transit. That was something that was echoed by our focus groups, and so that objective has been updated. And then there was a request to make sure that the objectives and measures were focused on improving the pedestrian environment to encourage non-motorized travel and improve transit access. So that objective has also been updated, and we'll see that shortly as well. The PPC had a couple of similar comments. The resiliency goal, similarly to this committee, they felt didn't seem to match their idea of what resiliency was. And again, they had a problem with the wording of unusual conditions. So that, as we said, has been updated. And they also pointed out the emissions objective and measure that was included as a draft in the last version needed to be more specific and consider decreasing idling, which has more of an impact on emissions than other types of VMT. So we actually changed that performance metric so that the VMT is stratified by speed, so that slower, that very slow travel, which has the higher emissions rate, would be counted more severely than non-congested travel. On the next slide, you can see the font gets smaller, and that is because we had a very animated discussion with the TAC in July. So a lot of these we were able to incorporate, and a lot of these were some ideas that we did not manage to incorporate, just some of them for technical reasons, and some of them because they were in conflict with some of the other committees. So from the safety objective, there was the request also about personal safety, but wanted to make sure that it was accounting for all modes, not just drivers. So the measure and methodology that we're showing in the revised version does incorporate all modes and does incorporate that personal security that we've talked about. Again, the resiliency goal and unusual conditions. Okay, check that one off 3 times now. There was a discussion about the objectives needed to account for all aspects of what was called usability by the TAC members. So they wanted to address affordability, access by folks with disabilities, cost as a measure of are things affordable, can people use them? And so some aspects of this we were able to incorporate into revised accessibility objectives and measures, and we'll see those. Others we were not able to incorporate, particularly the cost element was one that we weren't able to incorporate, and that's primarily because NVTA can't really impact the cost to the customer of using transit. Not because we don't agree that it's a good thing that transit be affordable, but because it's not something that NVTA can really impact. They also have the comment about decreasing idling as part of the emissions metric, so that was also incorporated. And there was a rather boisterous discussion around how delay and congestion would want to be accounted for. And there was a discussion about whether all delays should be counted the same, which is how the previous versions of transaction have done this, or whether Trips that experience a longer percentage of delay should be counted more heavily. So for example, 10 minutes of delay on a 10-minute trip would be counted as more heavily than 10 minutes of delay on a typically 6. And so that was the discussion that was had about should different delay be weighted differently. And while I think everybody nods in agreement that on a personal level, 10 minutes of delay on a 10-minute trip is worse. Where we've come to is that on a system level, which is what we're dealing with, everybody's delay is counted equally. And that we felt that that was actually potentially more equitable and a better way to make decisions than weighting shorter trips as more important than potentially longer trips. So at this moment, the measures that we're proposing would weight all delay equally for everybody across the region. On our next slide, so these are our updated goals. On the far left, you can see our updated goals. In the middle column, we have the July versions for reference. So our mobility goal has been really just improved legibility of the wording. So now reads enhanced quality of life of Northern Virginians by improving performance of the multimodal transportation system. The accessibility goal, as mentioned, has been updated to incorporate some equity at the goal level, not just at the objective measure level, sorry. So it now reads, strengthen the region's economy by increasing access to jobs, employees, markets, and destinations for all communities. And our resiliency measure, or goal, sorry, a resiliency goal, as requested by everybody, has been updated to be a little more clear and is now based on FHWA's definition of resiliency. And so it now reads, improve the transportation system's ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions and withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from disruption. I can interrupt me at any time if you'd like, but I can also just keep going. Sounds good.
Yeah, Vice Mayor Martinez had a question.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Well, I'm going to go back a few slides and talk about safety. One of the issues we've been dealing with for pedestrian walkways and trails is we seem to see an uptick in homeless and also safety on the WO&D trail. Have we considered this as part of our safety issues?
I heard an uptick in homelessness, and I think I missed the last part. Could you repeat the last part of that? I'm sorry.
Well, it's just that we are having issues with people on our trails that are walking that have to now be concerned about just homeless and then also being attacked on the trails. And I just wondered if those were kind of some issues that we haven't addressed yet, or do we really need to address?
So we have added personal security to the definition of safety, which I would imagine encompasses anyone being attacked on a trail. We have no measure related to the presence of homeless folks anywhere. And I would say we have no ability to impact that from transportation projects. So other than something that would be improving personal safety, whether that's lighting or something along those lines, I don't think there's much else we could do to address that particular issue.
Well, I was actually thinking about lighting and maybe making sure our trails we don't have places, clearing the sides of the trail a little more. But, again, this is just something that's happening to us locally, And I didn't know if that was a big concern.
I'm not sure.
I can't think of a way we could, I'm sleepy. I can't think of a way we could impact personal safety on the trail. That might be, first of all, the lighting, and Herndon has lit a lot of our part of the trail. I don't know how we did it, but all of our lights go down so they don't cause a lot of light pollution. But the other thing, I went to a women's college, and all over campus, we had these poles that had call boxes on them. And they weren't, they were spaced and they all had blue lights on them. So when it was dark, you could find them. I don't think the homeless people are a safety issue. I think that, knowing what I know about homeless people, which isn't a lot, I think that probably the attacks that are happening are not.
Well, as far as the homeless people, I think a lot of his perception of people walking the trails that feel threatened. And I do like the idea of the lighting. And I've also seen some trails, especially on the West Coast, where they do have intermittent phone boxes that can be used.
Well, we're gonna get to the objective and measure in a minute. We can see how well those sorts of things would fall into that.
Well, I didn't want to take over the conversation, so I was willing just to listen, and I appreciate your consideration.
So taking a look at mobility. Oh, yeah, I skipped one, didn't I? Okay, so just a very quick reminder, the performance measures, as Keith already talked about, will be used to evaluate the impacts of those potential projects and measure progress towards goals and objectives. We already talked about each of those performance measures can be weighted differently, which we'll work on later in the fall. Some of the things we're trying to achieve with these objectives and measures, we want to make sure that they incorporate all modes and all the potential project types. We want to make sure that they reflect the core values. And we want them to be simple enough and, quite honestly, few enough in number that they can be explained to the public in a way that provides transparency to the project selection and funding process. So those are sort of our overarching goals for them, and that's why some of the reasons we've landed where we are at the moment. So under mobility, we have 3 objectives. Our first is reducing congestion and delay. And this is mandated by the legislation that requires transaction, among other things. So what we're looking at here are 2 proposed measures. And this would look at total person hours of delay in cars and total person hours of delay in transit or on transit vehicles as 2 separate measures. That is slightly different than the previous transaction in which those 2 items were combined into one total of person hours of delay. And we felt that first off, there was a request to see a higher focus on some of the other modes, and that because unfortunately transit remains a relatively small portion of travel in Northern Virginia, that by separating it out as its own measure, you would be able to see impacts to the transit side of things more if it wasn't lumped in with all of the congestion delay experienced by cars.
So given that these are categories that we're going to be using for people writing grant applications, essentially, the word reduce suggests that there's already congestion. What about people preventing future congestion?
So yeah, no, that's a really good point that we should make at the beginning, right? All of the analysis that will be done looking at comparing a build version, right? So with a project to a no build version without the project in 2045. So it's looking at what would congestion or any of these other measures look like in 2045 versus what would it look like if we built fill in the blank? Okay, so that's true for all of these. So they're all long-term future things, and they're all looking at the difference between a build and a no build.
Yeah. Supervisor.
So in my area, I've got a few places that are going to be very high density transit oriented development. I don't see how any of these measures would measure, say, pedestrian mobility, time to cross, say a 6-lane road to get to Metro or to get to a job. How are we going to measure mobility for pedestrians and bicycles in those projects?
Measuring mobility in of itself, if we think of it as we've defined it here, as the performance of the multimodal transportation system, right? If we think about performance of the pedestrian and bike network, that becomes a little bit harder to measure and to quantify because it does get very granular, right? So are we adding a crosswalk? Are we doing something like that? But we can't make anyone walk faster than they already walk. I am a prime example of that. And so right now we're looking at improvements to the pedestrian network, the bike network under the accessibility measure, goal. And we have an entire objective and set of measures devoted to that there. Mostly because it feels like it is easier to measure in that way. It's not a performance issue per se, it's an availability and a quality of what is provided.
I would suggest that in our urbanizing areas, we might want to look a little more closely. I think it can very well be a measure along these lines. I know there aren't any good models or measurements for that yet, but frankly, I think it would be helpful. Especially as we move from a transportation system that's clearly, at least where I am, designed for the automobile. And we're having a retrofit with very visible crosswalks, with traffic calming measures, all sorts of things to improve the pedestrian.
And if I could just add to that, we are contiguous, our areas, and the same thing is happening in Herndon. Herndon and Reston have basically been rural farming areas within the past 50 years, and now they're turning into, they're already very dense, and they're about to become much denser. And if we're going to calm and ease future congestion, we have to use micromodalities, we have to use bikes, we have to use walking. And those have to become major ways of people commuting, not just for pleasure, but also for commuting. So we're going to have to, I really do support Supervisor Alcorn's suggestion that we really need to see them, to take them up to a more important level in our planning.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the group a question. You guys have suggested that we want to measure the mobility of pedestrians and bicyclists. In your minds, what does that improve? What does that look like? Improve it?
I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, in Herndon, and I think in Reston as well, we use the Washington Old Dominion Trail as a commuting. I mean, it is a major artery. Mm-hmm. So to not take that into account when we're considering traffic projects, traffic improvement projects, or to not take it into account on the same level as we do with cars and metro, I think is a mistake, and I don't know how to fix that.
Okay, so I do think, right, in the case of, hey, we're encouraging more people to say use the WNOD trail to commute. Those are, in theory, are folks taken off the streets, right? And so that is congestion that is reduced. And so that would be captured in this first measure, but it is captured for the cars who are, or the transit passengers who are experiencing the congestion. Is that what we're getting at here?
So, are you saying it could be a project listed? And when we rate it, it would be rated according to, like, for example, Vienna got, now I know this is car related, but we got money for a parking garage. But it was because it was taking cars off the street.
Correct,
And so that was relieving congestion.
correct,
So is that how you're looking at, that's how it would be rated?
correct.
And is
That's what
that-
we're currently thinking.
Right.
Does that
And is that
address
what you're
the
asking?
concern?
I want to
That might
add
not be what
something.
you're
I mean, that's not unimportant. That's very important, but Washington, we're not trying to encourage people to use Washington Old Dominion. It is becoming a traffic jam there.
It is.
Okay,
It's used as much as 495 and all those others. It's, they're having to widen it in some
Yes,
areas.
yes.
And,
okay.
And we're paying for it actually on some of the cases.
Exactly.
We are paying for it, with Arlington and Falls Church. So I think
Okay.
even our current model recognizes that it is a commuting trail
Mhm.
in addition to for people who may use it as recreational, but it is a commuting trail. And we scored it in comparison with all of the other projects, and we're able to fund it because of the volumes we saw on the trail, in addition to the other performance measures.
All right.
Yeah, I'll give you another example. Maybe it already gets scored, but right now residents of Vienna can commute to Reston via the WW Trail pretty easily. Tyson's is closer, but there's not a good way to bike.
No,
There's
no, you don't have a
And-
trail.
And at some point, there might
Right.
need to be a cycle track somewhere. you
Yes,
know,
agree.
for Vienna residents to get up there. And I just want to make sure that something like that, that we've thought through how things score.
Okay.
Because it would get people there faster.
Mhm.
I mean,
100%. And it
It
would
would.
make it would hard to I mean, it would do all that too. Right. You could get once we got there.
That's true.
Very helpful, thank you. All right, the second objective is improving, is improving travel time reliability. And again, here, we're looking at two measures. The first one, we use as a proxy for understanding where roadways will experience the most unreliable travel. So we talk about congestion duration because places that experience long periods of the day that are congested will have more reliability issues than places that don't. And because we're looking at a 2045 scenario, it becomes very difficult to predict the actual operational reliability on roadways. So we have to use a proxy in order to do that. So this was a measure that was used in the last transaction to do something very similar. So that's why you see that here again. The second one we want to look at is transit person miles that are traveling on either dedicated road right-of-way or right-of-way that has priority on it. So whether that's transit signal priority or a dedicated bus lane or Metro Rail or VRE, it's accounting for improving the reliability of those transit trips for those customers.
Okay. So one of the things that I'm kind of just like hung up on is this issue of simplicity, wanting things simple. And so I'm looking for, and maybe it's not a goal and you don't measure it, if there's a means or whatever, it's a strategy. So if somebody came up, so for example, if it was proposed a circulator route that probably is a lot simpler and would probably get more people on it. There a way to would that get some kind of credit or measure in here? Maybe only because more people would be on it, and then you've got to think they would. Am I making sense? Is that I'm trying to get at?
So if you've got more people on transit, you're affecting a lot of different things, right? So you're decreasing congestion on the roadways.
So it'll work. Okay, that's okay. Yeah, that's how it'll work. Okay.
Let me think of another example, and I guess this gets back to the reduced congestion and delay. You have a situation where pedestrians are trying to cross a road.
Mhm.
And they have to wait 2 minutes, 3 minutes for the crosswalk. But if there were a tunnel or a bridge, then you could move, a total of 700-800 people, during rush hour faster. You're not doing anything to reduce BMT. You're just getting people there faster.
Correct.
How would that?
So I think we'll get to some of that
Okay.
in the metric that is focused on the pedestrian and bicycle stuff. I will say it is not strictly focused on travel times for those folks. So that's something that we may want to think about.
Because I'm thinking of the Ballston entrance, the second entrance to Ballston, Arlington, which saves people 10 minutes walk,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
If you're coming from.
Which is why we're building it.
Exactly. Right.
So
So
what's-
that's important.
Yep, yep,
So
yep.
what's a really interesting thing about that example that you just gave
Yes.
is travel time savings for transit passengers, the model will capture. So if they're walking to Ballston to get on the train or on a bus,
Right.
it will get counted for. It's only the pedestrians that never get on
Transit.
to walk. Correct. Those of us who never get on anything with a motor, that's the only thing right now that the model isn't properly accounting for. So the transit access improvements will be fully accounted for in the model. It's that one other area that we need to think about.
And it's something that our mode splits do. We're planning 5-10%, mode splits that don't get on transit, don't get in the car.
What you want.
Right.
Right.
So, but
Right, so bicyclists on the WW Trail, they get caught Maple Avenue. Indiana, but if they're going to work, that does not get caught.
thank you.
The last objective that we have on here is reducing transportation-related emissions. Again, as we discussed during the deja vu portion of our agenda, we have now looking at VMT stratified by speed, so that the congested VMT, where there's more idling and therefore more emissions per mile, would be counted and weighted more heavily than the lower emissions. That is what this model metric is looking at. I will also point out that we've highlighted its emissions by non-zero emissions vehicles. So thinking about the future in which there may be a much higher proportion of electric vehicles, we want to make sure that there are other ways that those emissions can be addressed. This will, from a modeling perspective, require us to think of sort of a baseline assumption of what that's going to look like in 2045. And we talked about this a little bit last time, is eventually there will be some scenario planning around this in which we can play around with that number and see what the impacts of that assumption would really be. So if we can do things to really grow the market penetration of electric vehicles, what would that do to, say, this measure in particular?
So the reduction of emissions and the modeling of delay seem almost to be the same thing. The only difference is because idling is delay, right?
Some of it, yeah.
So are those going to double weight? Same thing?
It does place a little bit more emphasis on locations that are congested. That is true. They are very different numbers in the sense that here we're going to be counting all of the VMT. It's just going to be weighted more heavily for the congested VMT. So even the uncongested VMT is producing emissions and will be counted. It's just that the congested emissions are producing. The congested VMT is producing more and therefore would be weighted more heavily.
One last
Yes,
question.
go ahead, Supervisor. Yep.
Telecommuting projects, those get scored positively by what? Reduced congestion.
By reducing congestion, by reducing VMT,
Yeah.
or by increasing electrification. I think are the big
For
ways.
telecom.
All right, try to come into accessibility. We have simplified the objectives under this goal a little bit after a lot of discussion, both with the committees and with the staff group. So the first objective here remains the same, and that's improving access to jobs. Again, the way this one is calculated is from a measure perspective, is thinking about how many jobs the average resident can get to within a certain amount of time. And so this is a measure that was used in the last transaction as well, looking at how many jobs can the average resident get to in 45 minutes in a car or in 60 minutes via transit, so that we understand that. So that produces some numbers for the average resident, but what we wanted to add in this time was also thinking about how that compares to accessibility for the residents of our equity emphasis areas. So that there's a separate measure that is looking at, are you improving access to jobs, which we use as a proxy for economic opportunity, for education opportunities, for a number of things, for those populations that may need it the most. And so we can really focus in on what we're doing for those zones and for those areas a little bit more by having this second accessibility measure.
So are you saying that, for example, if we have a project that, so Herndon has some areas of affordable housing, not Section 8 housing, but just free range affordable housing. If we arrange for projects in that area to allow for greater accessibility for those to transit, that would be weighted.
There would be credit given then under both the general accessibility measure, because everybody who has access to that would have improved accessibility. But also, there would be credit given for improving access for those low-income residents.
And then what about pedestrian projects? Because a lot of populations don't drive, maybe, or they might walk, they might take their bike.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so our very next measure and objective, that's really fine. We're on the right page now. Is really looking at improving the walk and bike environment. And so that is, we're calling it reducing dependence on driving alone by improving conditions for people accessing transit and using other modes. So we're looking at this as a slightly more qualitative measure than some of the other ones. But this would be anything that improved access to our high capacity transit system in the region, anything that improved the walk or bike environment, including providing better access for disabled communities, other folks, and also improving availability of information about those other options, which plays really nicely into what we heard from those focus groups about just not knowing about what they are. And so that would cover anything that's improving trails, improving crosswalks, improving
Question? Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
On improving the access to jobs and reduce dependence on driving alone, etc., are we staying away from putting any kind of rezoning in there? That, making special districts along, for example, different areas that would allow people to have those kind of accesses?
So generally speaking, NVTA has no power to affect land use.
Land use is the responsibilities of the locality.
Correct.
Oh, no, I understand. I understand.
We take what you provide to us.
No, I understand that. But on some of these projects and stuff, we can help influence or advocate for certain zoning.
Yeah. Ms. Bachman is saying yes.
Yes. But that would really be your local governing body's decision to help, your project perform better in this particular measure by some of the land use decisions you make.
Well, that I agree with. You know, I wouldn't want NTVA telling me what to do with my zoning. But if they're creating transportation projects along a certain path that would help me, you know, that definitely would be able, you know, they could influence my decision.
Yes, thank you, Vice Mayor Martinez. Did you want to follow up? Do you have anything else? I think,
I have a question. Yeah. What about trees? What if you've got a big, long sidewalk and not many trees? Okay, we find, or actually, now. And it's just a real unpleasant place to walk, you know? And so you improve it, which we're often doing, trying to make things walkable. Does that do any good? Does that fit anywhere?
So
It'd be really nice to be able to get nice trees.
from a technical perspective, and that's the only answer I'm going to give, and then I'm going to let Mario answer. From a technical perspective, that would be improving the walking environment. And so, yes, it would qualify under this measure. Now, whether or not NVTA can fund the planting of trees, I'm going to leave to other people to answer.
Not independently, it really needs to be a part of a project that meets, you know, the objectives and proposed measures once adopted.
But if you improve the sidewalks and the access and everything else, and also put in a bunch of trees.
And I would say that's a part of the project.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Other, yes, Supervisor.
Follow up on that, you know, one of the things Fairfax County and our transit-oriented development planning efforts to get people to walk. It needs to be convenient, it needs to be safe, but also it needs to be interesting. And so, I would hope that in our scoring that we would take that into consideration. You know, trees might or might not be interesting, but
And Arlington County, yes.
but if we are looking to, and I realize this is qualitative, but again, where we can figure out how to quantify the pedestrian.
Gets to that whole biofilm.
Yes.
That's part and parcel.
you have somebody else?
Well, related to that, you know, when we're when somebody is looking at one of these projects as an overall thing, they're looking at, you know, does it do this, does it do that, does it do this? Can they also just look at it and say qualitatively, this is a beautiful project that's going to improve the whole world by just this little spot being improved? Is that, can you give a point for quality of living?
Like people want to be there?
Yeah. Because we don't want to be building stuff just to, I mean, we do have to build stuff just because we have to build it, but a lot of these are in towns or neighborhoods, and making a quality product should have some value. Supervisor.
Yes, Mr. Jeff.
Yeah, to just want to be clear, here we're talking about transaction, long-range plan. So transaction is a fiscally unconstrained, geographically unconstrained plan, and the inclusion of any project in transaction is not a commitment to funding by NVTA to any of them. But it is, if you like, it puts them on the menu. It puts some of them on the menu, because some of the projects in transaction would not be eligible for funding by NVTA anyway. For instance, if they were in the District of Columbia, we wouldn't fund them. But they would make sense to be in the long-range plan because Northern Virginians travel to the District of Columbia. The other thing I said about transaction is, as of right now, I don't know the exact number, there's something in excess of 400 projects on the project list, which essentially means these projects will be evaluated in what Daria referred to earlier as the build network, something that's not there now. But we will not be evaluating 400 projects one by one. Okay, so we'll be grouping them together in logical ways And as we group them together, then the sorts of things you're talking about become very diluted in terms of how a project would need to be a mega project, by which I mean to say something maybe in excess of $300 million, to have enough of a kind of a footprint, enough of an impact. When grouped with other projects, its influence would stand out. But the kind of the really tiny nuances of projects, kind of gets averaged out when you start grouping projects together. So I just want to set that expectation. We won't be evaluating individual projects in transaction. We don't have the resources to do that, and even if we did, we'd still be doing it for 3 or 4 years.
Having done this before, I can attest.
No, so when it comes to funding, there's been a lot of talk about, can we fund this project? How will this project look? That's the 6-year program, right? So at that point, we take into account some analysis that comes from transaction, together with a bunch of other things which are unique to the 6-year program evaluation process. So transaction will feed into that at some level. But again, the granularity from transaction is not likely to be deep enough to pick up the sorts of things you're talking about in our funding process.
Okay, so it shouldn't be included as a measure. We can
It
do
shouldn't
it.
really be included as a measure because it would be too difficult to measure. And that's the other important thing about measure that Dahlia mentioned, but I would emphasize is if it's not measurable, it's not a measure.
Right.
It's great to have ideas about it. It would be nice if we could credit a project for this. But if we have no way of measuring it, and by measuring it, I mean predicting it in 2045, then it's meaningless. It would be spurious accuracy to pretend that we could do it. We couldn't do it. So again, one of those manage expectations on that side as well.
But at some point down the line, we might get to that point. I mean, we've got biophilia and they've got definitions. I mean, I think there are attempts to get to that. So I appreciate the warning.
And we're not the only funding entity, for some of these things to be undertaken, given, we are trying to marry what we can do with under the constraints of the law, if you will. But, there's 30%, there's smart scale, there's a myriad of funding sources that we really utilize to implement a lot of these projects, because it's rare that we're the sole funding entity as we talk about funding programs. So just because the authority may or may not be, or in this case, may not be able to fund all things of all components of a project, doesn't mean that other funding sources are not available. But Keith is absolutely right for transaction, given that it's geographically and fiscally unconstrained, we do have to have some measures. And then when we get to the funding program, that's when we take a closer look of quantitative versus qualitative. But when we talk about beautification and things of that nature, that's very subjective, if you will. And, it's very difficult unless, like Keith noted, you have a huge mega project that's going to check off a lot of those various aspects, but still the focal is reducing congestion.
Right. That makes sense.
Okay. Anything else on this page? We've got one more goal. I know. Okay, so this is our resiliency goal. We've got 2 objectives here. So one is, as we've discussed, improving safety and security of the multimodal transportation system. So that at the moment, from a safety perspective, not a security perspective, is looking at potential for crash reduction. And this would be based off of work that's already been implemented by VDOT as part of Smart Scale. And that is multimodal. So it does look at pedestrian, it looks at bike, it also looks at cars, improving transit, things like that. But we'd also want to layer in some of the personal security things that may be left out of the VDOT measure. So the things like increasing lighting or other security issues that we've talked about. So we want to layer that in on top of what the VDOT methodology is already looking at. So that's that one. And then the last objective and measure is, again, something that's sort of mandated by the legislation, is looking at maintaining operations of the regional transportation system during extreme conditions. And so this is an objective that has been in transaction before, along with the measure that's associated with it, which is really looking at if we have a surge on the network. So if everybody tries to get home at the same time, it was originally designed to account for a homeland security emergency, that sort of thing. How does the system perform? And so it's really looking at, the way we measure it is we throw 10% additional demand at the network and see how it performs from the perspective of congestion and delay.
I'm gonna leave trees for water. It's just interesting, you know, this, everybody has different views. So when we're looking at safety and security, so what pops into my head now is visions of, you know, our roads have been turned into rivers in these huge microbursts, or in Philadelphia, people were diving off bridges, making dives into the river, which was like it's a highway, but it had so much water in it because of the storm. So, and then, you know, some metro that gets, so that feels like part of the resiliency, because that kind of gonna fit in here, because I will say, in the past, at times, VDOT has had projects that cause problems with water. So does water fit in here? Stormwater, you know?
So the moment.
I will say, I know VDOT is looking at it. At the September CTB meeting, there was an entire presentation given about roads that are impacted by water, and, you know, making sure that they get out of these situations where you have the water levels rising and now they have to go back in and work or put more money into the road. I'm going to try to pull that up. For this, Delia, I'll turn it back over to you, but I do know that the commissioner just gave a presentation to the CTV about this.
I mean, it's huge, people getting trapped in their cars, right? And sometimes, as I say, sometimes the roads themselves are creating more problems. Maybe we've gotten past that. I see it, I mean, I think, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks for your being.
Libby, are you talking about like flash flooding instances?
Yes, that's what, when you get these microbursts and stuff, and suddenly, and we're getting more and more of them, and the roads turn into rivers, and sometimes the construction of the road is actually blocked. That's sort of in the old days. And then the water, when it can't go in and fill in the pipe anymore, it comes out and it goes right where it used to be.
Okay.
And
So in what I'll call the sort of standard transaction analysis, we are not planning to predict increased instances of flooding of any type. And I'm definitely sure our modeling cannot account for flooding caused by roadways, because we are modeling the transportation side of it, not the water side of it. So that's one thing we currently cannot do. The other thing I will say, though, is that I mentioned earlier some of the alternative scenarios. And we talked about this a little bit last time, but one of the scenarios we want to look at is what the transportation network would look like, how it would operate if some of the infrastructure that we have or are planned to have do continue to be affected by, whether it's sea level rise, whether it's inland station, whether it's any of these other things, to get an understanding of, can our system function that way? If not, what are potentially some additional needs that might come from an analysis like that? And so we would use sort of work that's already been done of looking at some of the potential for flooding to identify which facilities are at risk for that, to set up that scenario, but not as part of sort of this standard evaluation process.
that makes sense. It makes me feel a little better. And I will say, this is just like, you know, let's try. I mean, I don't know about this stuff at all. I'm not, but I do know, because I hear from our staff, that the standards so far are 10-year floods. And that's not working anymore at all, but that's what the engineering stands. So I just, you know, I just toss out, want to make sure as we move forward, we don't use those old standards. Putting in my 2 cents for what it's worth.
Okay. Okay, that's all I have. I know you're as glad about it as I am. So those are, as they stand, the proposed objectives and measures. I have taken a bunch of notes. We have 2 more of these committee meetings, I think, both next week, where we'll have similar conversations with your counterparts and other committees. And when we come back to you in October, these will have changed again, and we will in fact be asking them to take action, correct? Got that.
Thank you. All right, yeah, go ahead.
Just
Councilmember.
one last. On all of these, the methodology has been listed. And I understand the methodology that we're using is the Washington Council of Governments methodology, is that right?
No, so we are in the process of building our own travel demand forecasting model that is
Interesting.
very, very impressive. Like, I rarely get that reaction when I talk about travel demand forecasting model. But okay, so we are building our own. It starts from the MWCOG forecasting model because there is a lot of useful information and useful methodology in there that we want to save. But from there, we have already made a couple of additions to the standard COG process, including adding things like TNCs, so Uber and Lyft, which aren't represented in the model, the ability to account for connected and automated vehicles, things like that that we really need to be able to do for this. And then we're also integrating that with, nobody's going to react the same way, with the dynamic traffic assignment model. Yeah, that's the face. Dynamic traffic assignment, which allows for much more detailed and fine-grained understanding of traffic operations. So whereas, really quick example, and then I'm going to let everybody stop talking about this. The standard COG model assigns trips for like the entire peak period at once. So that's in the afternoon, that's a 4-hour period. It says this is what everybody's doing. Dynamic traffic models are able to look at a 15-minute increment and really understand how congestion and ridership and choices are changing over the course of the day. And it gives you that much finer level of understanding of what's going on. So there's that is the model we're referring to. It's still in process. We're still working on it, but we've got deadlines, so we're working on that pretty quickly.
That's great.
Thank you. Okay, are we ready to?
And I will be brief because I'm looking, I know the time. Just a reminder, the call for projects for the FY 22 to 2027 6-year program closes on October 1. It is an automated system, if you will. So October 1 at 5 p.m. Your staffs are well aware because the call has been open since July 1. At this time, we NVTA staff, we're working or beginning our initial phases of talking about the revenues we think we will have available to populate the 6-year program. And I call it a 6-year program, but it's really adding fiscal years 26 and 27.
I just
Yes.
want to signal to Chair comment. I'd like to have a brief discussion on the date of the meeting after next.
I was just going to bring that up.
Because
Thinking like,
these next 2 meetings are really critical now.
yes.
So the October 27th meeting shown on the agenda is fine. That's your regular 4th Wednesday of the month. And that's been scheduled for since the beginning of the year. And that's the meeting at which we'll be asking you to take action, recommendations on the goals, objectives and measures that we've talked about this evening, and we'll come back to you with a final set. The subsequent meeting is, and actually at that meeting we'll also be sharing some information with you from the online survey, so you can see from those 2,300 people who ranked various things, you'll get, as will we, some insights to how the public feels about different priorities for the region, which very much weighs into the objectives and the measures. Doesn't mean you're committed to them, but it's information you need to be aware of. So we'll be asking you to take action on the weights associated with the measures in November. And we had previously scheduled your November meeting for November 17th, because that's the third Wednesday of the month, because the fourth Wednesday of the month is what I call Thanksgiving Eve. And we figured that you prefer not to have a meeting that evening. But the authority meeting in November would ordinarily be on the second Thursday of the month. This year, the second Thursday is Veterans Day. And so right at the beginning of the year, we scheduled the authority November meeting for November 18th, which will be the day after the rescheduled PCAC meeting in November. And we
Not enough time to turn.
it would be inappropriate for you to be voting on the weightings for the measures when the authority have not yet approved the measures themselves,
Exactly.
because they
Okay.
might change. Now, we hope they don't, but we can't assume that the staff recommendation will be what they actually accept and approve. So we basically have to, I'm afraid, reschedule the rescheduled meeting to be later than November 18th, but, sorry, later than November, later than November 18th.
Yeah.
the authority meeting.
Or,
But it has to be before Monica's meeting packet is distributed for the December meeting, which would be December. The distribution date is December 2nd. So that is a window which has got a few horrible options in it.
okay,
Um,
so I'll make a suggestion that we could either do November 30th, which is a Tuesday, or we could do December 1st. Is December 1st enough time? I know it's the second that the meeting packets go out.
I can't do Tuesday. And I would
Okay.
like to be.
Right, so would December 1st work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe not for staff.
For us, yes, staff, I'm looking at.
This one, the sixth. Don't love it, but it still gives us enough pulse.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, whatever you want will work for us, except that we've got to get stuff ready for the authority meeting.
Right. I don't see us doing Thanksgiving
packets, so
and
I'm gonna have to send a part 2 after the second.
We'll also have to move the TPC meeting.
we have our meeting on that Sunday.
And we are
Thank you.
to
The first actually is a bad day.
So,
Well, the other dates I had, which were options, but I like to say they're horrible options, will be Friday, November 19th,
oh,
I could do that.
Monday, November 22nd, Tuesday, the 23rd, although I think Tuesday is generally a bad night. Wednesday, November 24th, Thanksgiving Eve, which was the original date of your meeting.
Yeah, and you will probably be here alone.
Or Monday, November the 29th.
But that's when Vienna has their.
well,
Fifth Monday, do you have meetings on your fifth Monday?
I know, you're right, you got me. We do have a holiday stroll. I'm not sure when our holiday stroll is a big event. So let me check. Oh gosh, I'm sorry, everybody. Let me check on that. That might actually be because we usually save that date for holiday stroll. So that could be that. I apologize. I don't know if anybody wants to come on Friday.
I can't do Friday.
I'm not.
That's our 100th anniversry celebration. It's been
19th.
postponed for a year.
Yeah, and oh, wow.
Wow, that's big.
That's big.
You're all invited, you want to come? It's gonna be
I gotta
cool.
go. I gotta go.
It's gonna be cool, it's gonna be cool. I'll have cupcakes for you.
I mean, the 22nd, well,
Manassas has a council meeting on the 22nd.
yeah, I think the first, at least it sounds like the first for the group is good for us, but I don't know. Is that not doable for you all?
I can,
December
worst
1st.
case scenario, I can send the packet out in 2 sections, really. Mine December 2nd, and then quick turnaround internally for us to get this item out.
Well, we'll poll the entire committee, because obviously some people are not
Right,
here
I'll
or
still need it,
there,
right,
so
I'll
we
still
want
need
to make sure
that.
everyone gets.
Okay.
But I just wanted to air it just to eliminate some. So basically, it sounds like the 2 options we should poll people on would be the Monday, the 29th,
Possibly.
Yeah,
possibly.
I don't think I
subject to
can do
Vienna,
that, but.
or December 1st.
Yeah. And it is an important meeting, right? Yeah, that,
Yeah, so it doesn't sound like November 29th works. It sounds like December 1st.
part of my category.
I'm just checking.
The first one worked for me, we'll make that work.
Okay.
I do apologize for this, but
Oh, your fault. That's okay.
Veterans Day fell on
I know.
the second Thursday of the
Doesn't always
month.
work. That's okay.
all I can say is I'm glad we discovered it this month rather than
Yeah.
next month.
Yeah, right. No, exactly.
So I would say let's tentatively hold Wednesday, December 1st as the date, and then we'll circle back with the other members. But we have, majority of here, but we will circle back with the other members.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay, that sounds
Isn't
good.
that good news?
All right. So, okay. All right, and you will send something out about that, about December 1st, for
Yeah.
room, sorry.
We'll follow up tomorrow.
Room, sorry. Okay, excellent. All right, I think, are we done?
Yes.
I think we're finished. Okay. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Good thoughts, everybody.